Good evening, and it's good to see you. I can't see you because I've minimized you so I can focus on the screen. But yeah, so Steve had asked me to do this session on renovation of the heart from Matthew 5, which I'm delighted to. And I think it's really important that we understand where this fits in Matthew's gospel, because it's particularly when we get into all the nitty-gritty bits in Matthew 5, it's very easy to lose the wood for the trees. So we're looking at 5:17 to 6:18, which of course is part of the Sermon on the Mount. And the question is, where does the Sermon on the Mount fit with the rest of Matthew's gospel? So forgive me if you've done this before, but the opening kind of 3-4 chapters of Matthew basically set up the thematic net of Matthew. That is, what are the issues that need to be resolved, including, unjust suffering, and what about outsiders, and who's the Messiah, and or what do we do with sin, and all those sorts of questions. And Matthew kind of heads towards the peak, which is in chapter 28. And the solution to all those issues basically is to go and make disciples of all nations. And so Matthew's gospel, as you probably know, was the early church's favorite gospel. And it's because it's not really an evangelistic gospel. Matthew really is a laborer's training gospel. So it's, sorry, I'm just trying to get my watch so I can sit. Yeah, so Matthew's gospel is really, it's a training manual to equip us to be involved in the Great Commission. That's the purpose. And so Sermon on the Mount is part of that preparation, and the passage that we're looking at tonight is a particular part of that preparation. So as we go through, kind of in our head, we need to be thinking, how does this stuff equip me to be involved with the lost and to be involved in the Great Commission of going to all nations? So you're probably aware, but the Sermon on the Mount is one of 5 main teaching blocks in Matthew. It's the first of the teaching blocks. And the Sermon on the Mount is really about what kind of people we need to be in order to be involved in God's mission. The next teaching block is in chapter 10, where Jesus sent out the 12, and that's, kind of instructions on attitude and heart and going to the lost. Chapter 13, right in the middle, are the parables of the kingdom, which is everything we need to know and understand about the kingdom, what it is and how it grows, to be involved in that. Chapter 18, the 4th teaching block, is really about what does it take to do mission in community. We can't do it by ourselves, but what kind of community do we need to be a part of in order to really see the gospel advance? And the last teaching block, chapters 23 to 24, there's a few more parables. There's talk about the end, but it's kind of like just keep in focus where all this is going, and stay aligned. And then it finishes then with the injunction to go and make disciples of all nations. So I hope you got a Bible with you. And so we're going to jump into the first Zoom group with that brief introduction. So you can have a quick look at Matthew 5:17 to 6:18. Skim it if you haven't read it before this evening. And then 2 questions. How does what you see in Matthew 5:17 to 6:18, how does that develop at the first half of Matthew 5, the Beatitudes and things like that? And then how might Matthew 5 to 7 contribute to the overall purpose of Matthew's gospel? So Steve, if you could break out rooms and we come back in, I don't know, 6 minutes or something like that. So this will just be a brief familiarize ourselves with breakout room and familiarize ourselves with the passage. So over to you, Steve. So here we are back to this thing again. Yeah, so hopefully you had a chance just to warm up. And what we're going to do is we're going to press on into this. So I gathered from our discussion group that you'd done maybe 2 previous sessions on Matthew 5, and now we've got kind of a huge swathe of stuff to cover this evening. So apologies if we don't go into quite the depth that you might like, but we'll try and hit the high points as we go through. So as we go through Matthew 5, there are 2 words that if we don't get and understand what they meant in context, we're just gonna miss what's going on here in the passage. And the first of those words is righteousness, and you can see it there in verse 19 and 20. That first little paragraph, the end of it. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so what does Jesus mean by righteousness here? Well, if you look at verse 19, it's basically how we practice and teach God's word. That's righteousness. And he's saying, look, I tell you that unless your righteousness passes that of the Pharisees, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so that might sound like salvation by works. It's not. It's saying that if you have a saving faith, it's got to make a difference in how we live and how it shows up. So James, in his epistle, would say faith without works is dead. And really what we have in the rest of Matthew 5 are examples of this sort of righteousness, what it needs to look like. And when we go to chapter 6, there are 3 acts of righteousness that he talked about. So in the Hebrew world, righteousness isn't like a moral code. Do I pass or do I fail? It's not like, have I got the right behaviors, or, you know, have I not violated some arbitrary set of rules? You know, like, it's not about like a moral standing thing primarily. It's primarily, righteousness is primarily a relational word. And it means, am I in right relationship with people, and am I in right relationship with God? And so there's a wonderful story in the Old Testament, Genesis 38, Judah and Tamar. And you remember that Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law. Her husband dies, and Judah refuses to give her another of his sons to be her husband. So she dresses up as a prostitute, seduces him, gets pregnant, and when everything comes to light and everything's outed, Judah says this amazing line. Judah said, Tamar is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. So what was Judah's unrighteousness? Not keeping the kind of the social contract of propagating the family line. And Tamar was more committed to that than Judah was. And so righteousness here isn't about the moral behavior. I don't think it's necessarily affirming what Tamar did, but it's pointing out that righteousness is primarily a relational word, not just a moral behavior word. And so as we go through Matthew and we look at these areas of righteousness, primarily about, think of the impact on the relationships that happens when we either do or we don't live out of this way. Now, the second word, so the first is righteousness as a relational word, being and basically meeting the relational expectations with God and with others. Second word is heart. And since this is called Renovation of the Heart, this session, we need to understand what heart is. And I'm going to share a little model which comes from Dallas Willard's book, Renovation of the Heart, which is by far the most helpful model on this I've come across. And he would say, to understand a person, the heart is the center of the person, the deepest part of the person. And in the scriptures, heart is pretty much synonymous with the will or with the spirit. So in our normal, kind of Western way, we think heart is emotions. And we basically have to get rid of that understanding to understand the scriptures. Heart is basically the center of what we love. It's what we set ourselves on, and that's why it's related to the will. And there's so many passages which talk about what our hearts are set on or not set on. So the heart is something to be set, and that is also similar to the idea of a spirit, our spirit. So not in the sense of having this kind of ghostly, non-physical thing that floats off when you die. Again, that is not a biblical understanding of spirit. That's pagan Greek philosophy. But the spirit is more like the spirit of the person is like their personal energy and power. So if you have a spirited child, you have a very willful child. And it's in that sense that the word spirit is used of our inner lives in the scripture. So heart, will, spirit of a person is basically that inner strength, inner focus, the choices we make, and the whole orientation of our lives is set from the heart. Outside of that is what the scriptures call the mind, and that's a combination both of our thinking and our feeling. So that's where emotions come in. So it's almost impossible to have an emotion without a thought attached to it, and it's pretty difficult to have a thought without some kind of emotion attached to it. So those two things are what the scriptures talk about as the mind, and that's where we live our conscious life. The body is our little kingdom where we kind of act out what's going on in our heart and our mind. So that's our contact with the physical world. And then outside of that are our relationships. And again, to be fully human, I can only really be fully human as I'm in relationship with other people. And so the human soul is a relational thing. And you put all those together and you get the soul. So the soul is kind of, in Hebrew, it's the word nephesh. In Greek, it's psyche, but it's the integrated living being is a living soul. So in Genesis, when God made animals, he made them as nephesh, living beings. And when he made man, he made him as nephesh, a living being, same word. So the soul is how all these different parts tie together to give one integrated whole person. So, but the center is the heart. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to quote you just a little bit from Dallas Willard first. Thanks, Steve. I nicked these from your previous presentation. But Dallas Willard says this: we live from our heart. That's the part of us that drives and organizes our life, is not the physical. You have a spirit within you, and it has been formed. It takes on a specific character. I have a spirit, and it has been formed. The spirit within us takes on whatever character it has from the experiences we have lived through and the choices we have made. This is what it means to be formed. How we live in the world now and in the future is almost totally a result of what we have become in the depths of our being, in our spirit, will, or heart. So again, you can see I'm using spirit, will, heart synonymously. That is where we understand our world and interpret reality. And then we make our choices, we act and react and try to change the world. We live from our depths and we understand little of what is there. What is in our heart matters more than anything else for who we become and what becomes of us. So, yeah, so that's kind of the idea of heart being the very center of us. It's the center of our choosing, acting and reacting. And it matters more to God than anything else in our being. So, back into the discussion group, just two quick questions, just do this for 5 minutes. Why does living righteously matter for the flow of the gospel through us? So that definition of righteousness as being in right relationship, particularly with other people. Why does that matter for the flow of the gospel through us? And why is our heart, will, or spirit the key to this? And there are some verses down there, Proverbs 4:23. I'll take a note of them. Look some of them up. You might not have time for all of them. But why is our heart the key to living righteously, and so that the gospel can flow through our lives? I hope that was a useful session. And we are going to now attempt to cover 1.5 chapters of Matthew in a few minutes. So apologies if this is super fast, but here we go. Let me just minimize that again. So there we go. So it's just some, I'm not sure if you got to all of those verses, but certainly Proverbs 4:23 came up in our group, that above everything else, the thing that we've got to do most, guard our heart, for that's the wellspring of life. Everything we do flows out of our heart. Second verse, where have you gone? There's an interesting verse in 2 Chronicles 12:14 about one of the kings. Just the one-line summary of his life. He did evil because he had not set his heart on seeking the Lord. So see there, the heart is something that can be set. It's about our intentions, about what we give ourselves to. And if it's not guarded, if it's not set on seeking God, then it's inevitable that evil will come out of our life. Matthew 5:17-19. This is kind of why the heart matters, but the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and it's those that defile them. It's not what goes into us or what comes out of us, but out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. And those are pretty much the topics that Jesus talked about in the second half of Matthew 5. That's from Matthew 15. And then Colossians 3, again a verse on the heart. Then, since you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God, and set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. I was saying in our little breakout room, the session is called Renovation of the Heart. Matthew 5 and 6 doesn't really tell us how to get a renovated heart. But Paul in Colossians says it's kind of connected to what we set ourselves on. So we're instructed to set our hearts on the things of Christ, and we're also told to set our minds on that. So kind of what we allow ourselves to think on and meditate, what we allow ourselves to pursue, are kind of key things in shaping and forming our heart in the direction that God would have it. So into the section 5:17-20, we've referred to it a little bit at the beginning in terms of this idea of righteousness. And again, getting that, understanding what that word righteous actually means, it's about right living and being particularly in right relationship is key. So, he starts, don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So they still matter. They don't give us salvation, but everything that Jesus is doing is in keeping with them and the fulfillment of them. And then as going back to verse 20 that we quoted before, for I tell you that unless your righteousness, or how we actually live, passes that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. The end of the chapter, there's a similar statement, which is when Jesus is talking about the pagans, and he says, like, if you just do what the pagans do, you've got nothing to offer. So he's saying, like, if you really have faith in me, if you want to be a kingdom worker, you've got to have a life that's different to the kind of deadly legalism that you see in the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and it's got to be different from what the pagans are doing. There has to be a quantitative difference about our life. And he gives 6 case studies on righteous or unrighteous living in verse 21 to 48. And each one of those is introduced by that little formula. You've heard it said by the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, but I say to you. And so he's kind of reframing or correcting people's understanding of what the law was actually asking of them. And it wasn't just a legalistic box ticking exercise. It was to actually live out of the heart. And as he goes through, the real issue to understand what God wants is the question of what kind of father do you have? And so he talks about 6 issues, talks about anger, talks about lust, talks about divorce, talks about oaths, retaliation, and loving our enemies. And without going into the particulars of each one, you could just imagine how much hard soil in people's hearts are broken up when people aren't captured by anger, lust, breaking oaths, retaliation, and hating their enemies, but exhibit the opposite, kind of the godly opposite. And just how much of each of these issues are not really behavior issues as much as what's going on in the depths of us in our heart. In fact, a lot of them are really about a broken heart, hearts that are not whole and healed, and that we can't really live as God intends us to unless we've experienced kind of healing at the heart level. So I don't know if you've ever had a problem with anger and just tried not to be angry. It doesn't work. You don't get less angry by trying not to be angry. You get less angry by learning to focus on God and understand his heart. And so Matthew 21 through 48, look at these 6 issues. I just want to focus on one at the end, one issue, which is the bit of loving our enemies. And here's a picture of a field, farmer's field. You could imagine that, say, the left-hand side of the field belongs to a Christian and the right-hand side belongs to a non-Christian neighbor. Okay? And you look at that field and Jesus says, God, you've heard that it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. What kind of Father do you really have? He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So you look at that farm, one belongs to a righteous person, one to an unrighteous person. Which one gets the rain and the sunshine? And the answer is they get the same amount, because that's the character of God. And if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? And so again, it's like our lives have to be quantitatively different to the legalistic religiosity of the Pharisee and the teachers of the law, but they also have to be quantitatively different to the tax collector and the pagans. That people have to see, in order for the gospel to move, there has to be a credible evidence of God at work in our lives, and it's shown up through these heart issues. And interestingly enough, here Jesus even raises that simple thing of greeting someone to like a spiritual practice. If you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than the others? But you go into the office and there's someone who's maybe not as socially integrated or a bit new, and you take the initiative to greet them, to make them feel at ease and welcome, and suddenly you're doing what Jesus would be doing. And so the command is to like, don't just do what's socially normal and self-protective. Be perfect. Not do perfect things, but be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And so like these are the signs, that those little actions of just social initiative and grace, going beyond kind of what's expected socially, are signs that we're operating out of a Godward or renovated heart. So just thinking about things like anger, lust, and divorce and oaths and retaliation, what impact on the pagans would living the way that Jesus suggests in 21 to 48 have? And how would these teachings have totally broken the mold for Jesus's hearers? And we'll do another, let's go, I think we can do 10 minutes on this one, Steve.
Right, 10 minutes coming up.
Yeah, so you've got a good 27 verses to think about. So you can one or two and think about those in particular. So this is where we were. Yeah, just kind of like to keep this passage about living well or living righteously in terms of what it means to be a kingdom worker, which is what Matthew 5 to 7 is about. It's a job description or character description of a kingdom worker, and the kind of people that are vectors of the good news are ones who live in the way that Jesus is describing here. So chapter 6, he talks about acts of righteousness. The picture there I nicked from Steve's talk, which is, thank you again for the picture, Steve, is a picture of someone wearing a mask, and of course he uses a phrase like be a hypocrite. But he's still going on, which is so as a hypocrite is a mask wearer, someone who is pretending. So be careful not to practice your righteousness or do your acts of righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So again, the thing is like, what kind of father do I have? And how does that show up? And in chapter 6, 1 through to 18, there are 3 acts of righteousness. So this goes back to, unless your righteousness is beyond that of the Pharisees, and we've had kind of issues of the heart, and now here are like the spiritual discipline, acts of righteousness that need to be, again, quantitatively different for how the legalistic religious person would do it. And he talks about, talked about 3 things. Giving, which is verses 2 to 4, when you give alms. When you pray, which is the bulk, you can see the most amount of airtime is given to the prayer section. And then when you fast at the end. So notice in each of these kind of acts of righteousness or spiritual disciplines. It's not if you do them, it's when you do them. So the assumption is that we will be giving. The giving here is giving to the needy or giving alms. So there's an outward focus to the poor and needy. There's the majority of the text is around a prayerful, Godward focus. And again, the whole of that prayer is around what kind of father do we have, and how a father would love to protect and provide and guide his children. And then fasting. The third one, again, it's when, not if. And that's really an inward orientation. So we have an outward, an upward, and an inward orientation to these spiritual disciplines. Fasting is this area of kind of self-control, not so much control of self, not self in control, but self-control. And in each case, there's a thing of like, do these in secret. And I think one of the things here is Jesus saying, look, if you want to identify as a follower of Christ, don't use spiritual activities as the flag that you wave to say, hey, Christ is important to me. So like in chapter 5, when we see kind of this character stuff going on, where people are genuinely caring and they keep their word and they don't deceive and they don't make promises they don't keep and they don't pull out when it's inconvenient. That signals there's something going on in your life that's more than there's a hidden power to it. And the temptation is we want to identify as a Christian by saying, well, when I was at Bible study last night, or when I was at church on Sunday morning, and we kind of use the Christian activity as the flag to say, hey, Christ is important to me. And Jesus, I think, in Matthew 6, basically says, don't do that. Do all these activities, these acts of righteousness, of being rightly related to both God and to other people, are important, but they're not the flag you use to advertise anything. So the stuff on prayer, for example, it's like, don't just use meaningless repetitions and Babylon. Don't just quote the Lord's Prayer at 100 miles an hour in a part of your Sunday morning service. Don't do that. Engage with me as your father, and do this in secret. So that's not to say you can't pray a communal prayer, but it's saying that's not really the heart of what Jesus was talking about here. So these acts of righteousness, again, they need to go beyond what's legalistic, religious kind of model that they've kind of typically experienced, and there's a deeper reality to these things that needs to be lived out. So our final set of discussion questions would be, so first question is, how could using Christian activities as the flag to identify you as a believer confuse the gospel for the lost? How would that actually get in the way of the gospel? And so related to that, if you can't identify as a believer, so how do you identify as a believer amongst the lost if you can't use doing Christian activities as the signal that you send? Say that Christ is alive and real for me. So how does using Christian activities confuse the gospel? What do you do instead? Flag up Christ is for you. And then around these spiritual disciplines, the inward, the upward or Godward, and the outward, what would happen to your kingdom impact if you're missing any one of these? Okay, so those are, and I think we've got 8 minutes for discussion on this one. Well, welcome back. If you're anything like us, we got cut off midstream. So apologies for that. But I think these questions about if I can't use Christian act, we're saying, like, when a ship comes into Southampton, it has a flag on it. And when we first identify as a believer with our non-Christian colleagues or friends, we basically put up a flag and say, hey, this is who I am and what I'm like. And it's really critical that we think about what goes on that flag, because whatever's on that flag is going to be there for a long time in people's minds. And if the first thing that goes on the flag is activities, we're in danger of just communicating, come and do all these behaviors and activities that I do. That's what I really want for you. So we were thinking about what else would go on that flag. We thought about the Beatitudes to be really good things to have on your flag as what you're known for. And then the skill becomes in linking that not just to good time management and but relating it to a real relationship with Christ. So that's where our conversation went. Let me just finish off with the last PowerPoint. To sum up our time, and just really this is for yourself, and then I'm going to hand over to Steve. But just as we've covered quite a bit of ground this evening. So, and I also noticed I've misspelt bringing in that slide. But what has God been bringing to my attention about just, maybe the neediness of my own heart? Has just as we've touched on things, has there been anything that go, oh yeah, I need to, look at that's an area of need in my own life. And then, is there anything that actually a renovated heart, this is what it would look like, and this is what I could, ask God to work towards in my own life? And maybe is there anything like, well, what's my part in the advance of His kingdom as I live amongst the lost? So living with this renovated heart as a because we are vectors of the kingdom. We are Christ to the world. So one of the things I was going to say, if you look at Matthew 4, the people walking in darkness, I think it's 4:17, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light, which obviously you did. And you come into 5:16, just before where we pick up, but it's where Jesus says, you are the light of the world. And so we've gone from Jesus being the light to us being the light in one chapter. And then really this bit of 5 and 6 is unpacking what it means to live as light in the world, and what are the kind of things that would dim our influence or make us less salty. So thank you for this evening.